There are people who leave without saying goodbye, and there are people who come back without asking permission. But the most dangerous thing is not the leaving or the returning. The most dangerous thing is what gets uncovered when someone finally opens what should have been opened a long time ago. I'm going to tell you the story of Eleanor Caldwell and Constance Rivers, two women who loved each other in secret along the cobblestone streets of Savannah, Georgia. Until one night, without a word, without an explanation, Eleanor vanished. 12 years later, Eleanor came back with a single suitcase and a yellowed envelope pressed against her chest, a letter written by Constance the night before she disappeared. A letter Eleanor never opened. 12 years carrying it. 12 years without daring to read what was inside. When Constance opened the door and saw her standing there, drenched in the rain, with the eyes of someone carrying something she can no longer hold alone, she said one word, "No," and shut the door. But her hands were shaking on the other side. Because what that letter reveals is not a farewell. It is not a love confession. It is something neither of them expected to find. Something that completely changes the reason Eleanor left that night and proves that both of them were victims of the same lie. This is not just a love story. It is a story of silence, of manipulation, and of a truth buried for 12 years that, once it comes to light, destroys everything so it can be rebuilt. Stay with me until the end to hear this story. See you soon. The last time anyone saw Eleanor Caldwell walk down East Jones Street in Savannah, she had swollen eyes, a backpack slung over one shoulder, and the stride of someone who knows she will never look back. That was 12 years ago. Today, a rideshare pulled up in front of the old townhouse with the wrought iron gate, and out stepped a woman carrying a single suitcase, a yellowed envelope pressed against her chest, and the clenched jaw of someone arriving at a place where she is no longer welcome. The afternoon light fell over Savannah's historic district, in that amber haze that gilds the old brick facades just before the sun sinks behind the live oaks. The air smelled of damp earth, of pralines drifting from a candy shop on the corner, of magnolias hanging heavy and sweet over the cobblestones. But Eleanor was not breathing in the neighborhood. Eleanor was holding her breath. The driver asked if she needed help with the suitcase. She shook her head without speaking. She paid, shut the door, and stood on the sidewalk staring at the sage-green townhouse that had once been her home. The paint was more faded now. The wisteria her mother had planted by the door had spread across half the front wall, but the window on the second floor was exactly the same lace curtain, the same window box with red geraniums, as if someone had stopped time in that one corner alone. Eleanor pressed the envelope tighter against her chest. Inside was a letter she had not opened in 12 years. A letter that was not hers, but Constance's. And that was what nobody understood. Nobody understood why Eleanor had come back right now, right in October, right when Savannah was settling into its most beautiful season. The Spanish moss catching the golden light, the squares filling with tourists and the scent of roasting pecans from the street vendors on River Street. Nobody understood why she had left behind everything she had built in Charlotte, a steady editing job at a publishing house, a small but decent apartment in the Noda district, a life that from the outside looked complete, to return to the exact place she had fled without explanation. But what nobody understood least of all, absolutely nobody, was why she carried with her a letter she had never dared to read. Subscribe now. YouTube prioritizes subscribers, and those who aren't subscribed miss out on future stories. Eleanor pushed open the wrought iron gate that led to the interior courtyard. The hinges groaned the same way they always had, a low, drawn-out complaint, like an old grievance. The courtyard was just as she remembered, the herringbone brick path, the dry fountain in the center with moss creeping along its edges, the clay pots lined up against the south wall, some with dead plants, others overflowing with ferns that dripped moisture. The smell of trapped dampness, of old plaster, of memories compressed into every corner, hit her stomach like a fist. In the ground floor kitchen, visible through the screen door at the back of the courtyard, a gray-haired woman was shelling pecans over a wooden cutting board. Miss Dorothy, the neighbor who had lived in the garden-level apartment for 30 years, looked up and dropped a pecan shell. "Lord have mercy," she murmured, pressing her hand to her chest. "Miss Dorothy," Eleanor said, her voice contained, as if speaking any louder might break something. The old woman stared at her with those small, damp eyes that had watched 3 generations grow up in that townhouse. "Eleanor? Is that you, child?" Eleanor nodded. She did not smile. She could not. Miss Dorothy wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward her with quick, short steps, as though afraid the apparition might vanish. She took Eleanor's face in both hands, examined her eyes, the dark circles, the new thinness in her cheekbones. "You're too skinny," the old woman said, and there was more reproach than tenderness in her voice. "What are you doing here? Your mama doesn't live here anymore, honey. She moved to Augusta with your Aunt June about 4 years ago." "I know," Eleanor replied. "I didn't come for her." The silence that followed was long and thick. Miss Dorothy lowered her hands slowly, as if she suddenly understood something she would have preferred not to understand. "Then you're here for the one upstairs," she whispered. Eleanor did not answer. She looked at the narrow staircase that climbed to the second floor, the same staircase she had climbed thousands of times, the same staircase she had tiptoed down barefoot and crying the last night, while the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3 in the morning. "Constance isn't the same, Eleanor," Miss Dorothy said, in a tone that was nearly a warning. 12 years is 12 years. "I'm not the same either, Miss Dorothy." "Well, you better not be, because that girl already learned not to wait for anyone." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. The weight of those words was exact, surgical. Miss Dorothy had always had that gift, saying truths with the precision of a scalpel and the gentleness of a brick. She climbed the stairs without asking anything more. Each step creaked beneath her feet, like an accumulated complaint. When she reached the landing on the second floor, she saw the dark wooden door with the brass number 7, tarnished with age. The same door. Behind it, 12 years ago, an entire world had existed. Nights of coffee with cinnamon, books read aloud on the couch, laughter stifled so the neighbors wouldn't hear, hands reaching for each other under the table when someone else was present, and a complicit silence that was more intimate than any word. Eleanor knocked 3 times, slowly, like asking permission to exist again in that space. There was no answer. She knocked again, harder. Inside, footsteps, the scrape of a chair, the click of a lock. The door opened barely a few inches, and there appeared one dark eye, a furrowed brow, a tight line of lips. Constance Rivers was 41 years old, with black hair to her shoulders streaked with a few silver threads she did not bother to hide, and a gaze that could freeze time or set it on fire, depending on her will. That afternoon, when she saw Eleanor through the crack in the door, her gaze did neither of those things. Her gaze simply went out, like a candle someone blows on without warning. "No," Constance said. "Just that. No." And she closed the door. Eleanor stood motionless in front of the dark wood. She did not knock again. She did not call out her name. She stood there, suitcase at her side and the envelope pressed to her chest, breathing in that no as if it were the only oxygen available. On the other side of the door, Constance had pressed her back against the wall with her eyes closed and her hands trembling. She was not crying. She did not allow herself to cry. She had spent the last 12 years building a version of herself that did not need Eleanor Caldwell, And that work, that fierce, silent labor of tearing someone from the center of your chest, was not going to crumble because of 3 knocks on a door. But the hands were trembling, and the heart, that traitor that knows nothing of discipline, was beating with a force she hadn't felt in years. Constance opened her eyes and looked at the apartment that had been her refuge, her fortress, her island. The walls were covered in photographs, landscapes of the Georgia coast, portraits from farmers' markets, black and white images of weathered hands and children's smiles, all taken by her. The dining table was buried under papers, invoices from the gallery where she worked as curator, catalogs for the next exhibition, a half-finished cup of coffee. Everything in order, everything under control, everything exactly where she had placed it. Except Eleanor. Eleanor was in no plan. 10 minutes passed. 15. Constance listened to the silence on the other side of the door and thought Eleanor had left. She felt a bitter relief, like the feeling when you finally unclench your jaw after holding it tight for too long. The pain doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. But when she peered through the window overlooking the courtyard, she saw Eleanor sitting on the stone bench beside the dry fountain, suitcase at her feet and the envelope in her hands, watching the sky darken with the heavy October clouds that roll in from the coast. And something moved inside Constance. It was not forgiveness. It was not desire. It was something worse. It was curiosity. What was Eleanor doing with an old envelope pressed against her body as if it were the last thing she had left in the world? Constance yanked the curtain shut. She poured more coffee. She sat down. She stood up. She walked to the door. She went back to the window. She looked again. Eleanor was still there, motionless, like a statue someone had forgotten in the courtyard. It started to rain. Not a soft, poetic rain, but one of those Savannah downpours that falls as if the sky has cracked open, with fat drops that bounce off the cobblestones and turn the streets into temporary rivers. Eleanor did not move. The water ran down her hair, soaked her blouse, but she stayed there, sitting, the envelope now sheltered beneath her body, as though it were something alive that needed protecting. Constance came down the stairs almost running. "You are so stubborn," she shouted from the last step, her voice nearly drowned by the hammering rain. "You were always so stubborn." Eleanor looked up. Water streamed down her cheeks, and it was impossible to tell if there were tears as well. "I'm not leaving, Constance," she said with a calm that contrasted with every storm raging inside her. "Not this time." "You don't have the right to say that." Constance descended the last step and walked toward her through the rain, hair plastered to her face, fists clenched. "You left. You decided to leave without a word. 12 years, Eleanor. 12 years." "I know." "No, you don't know. You don't know what it was like to wake up and find your side of the bed empty. You don't know what it was like to go to your office and be told you'd resigned. You don't know what it was like to call your phone 200 times and hear the same thing every time. This number is no longer in service. You don't know what it was like to explain to your mother Eleanor, that I had no idea where you were, while she looked at me as if everything were my fault." The rain pounded harder. The courtyard had become one enormous puddle that soaked their ankles. Miss Dorothy watched from her window without daring to intervene. Eleanor stood up. They were face to face, drenched, their breath visible in the sudden cold the downpour had brought. "You're right," Eleanor said. "I don't know. I don't know what you lived through, but I know what I lived through, and I need you to hear me, even if it's just once, even if it's the last time." Constance wiped her hand across her face to push the water away. Her eyes were 2 dark wells where anger and something else, something she refused to name, competed for control. "I don't want to hear you," she said, her voice cracking. I don't want to know why you left. I stopped wanting to know years ago. Then why did you come down? Eleanor asked, and her voice was soft, almost a whisper barely audible above the drumming of the rain. Constance did not answer. She stood there in the downpour, mouth slightly open and wordless, because that question was a perfect trap, and they both knew it. Why had she come down? The answer was simple and devastating, because 12 years of silence had not been enough to kill what she felt. And that terrified her more than any truth Eleanor might carry in that yellowed envelope. Constance turned and went back up the stairs without another word, but this time, she left the door open. Eleanor picked up her suitcase, shielded the envelope under her arm, and climbed behind her, dripping water on every step, leaving a trail of puddles on the old hardwood, like breadcrumbs marking the way back to something both of them had given up for dead. Inside, the apartment smelled of coffee, old paper, and that particular scent that spaces inhabited by one person for a long time carry. A blend of meticulous order and well-managed solitude. Constance pointed at a chair by the table without looking at her. Sit down. Don't touch anything. Don't put the wet suitcase on the hardwood floor. Eleanor obeyed. She left the suitcase by the door, on the entry mat, and sat in the chair. Water kept dripping from her clothes and formed a small puddle beneath her feet. Constance threw her a towel from the bathroom without ceremony. "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Don't thank me," Constance replied, her back turned, making coffee with mechanical movements that betrayed an anxiety her face refused to show. "This isn't hospitality. This is so you don't ruin my floors." Eleanor dried her hair in silence. She studied every detail as if cataloging the changes. New books on the shelf, photographs on the walls she didn't recognize, a massive aloe plant by the window that hadn't been there before. Everything was new and old at the same time. Everything was Constance, and simultaneously, a Constance she did not know. The coffee was ready. Constance set 2 cups on the table, one in front of Eleanor, one in front of herself, and sat in the opposite chair. Between them, besides the dark wooden table, lay 12 years of unanswered questions. "You have 10 minutes, Constance said, looking her directly in the eyes for the first time since she had seen her at the door. 10 minutes to tell me what you came to say. Then you leave. That won't be enough. It's what there is." Eleanor looked at the cup of coffee, then at Constance, then at the yellow envelope she had placed beside her cup. She slid it slowly across the table toward Constance. "What is that?" Constance asked without touching it. "It's yours," Eleanor replied. "You wrote it. The night before I left, you slipped it under my pillow. I found it at dawn, with my backpack already packed. I kept it. I never opened it." Constance went pale. Her fingers, holding the cup, tensed until her knuckles turned white. "That's a lie," she whispered. "It's not a lie. Look at it. That's your handwriting on the front. My name, written in your hand. And the seal is intact. It was never opened." Constance looked at the envelope without touching it. Indeed, on the front, in that slanted script she would recognize anywhere in the world because it was her own, was written, "For Eleanor, when you're ready." The date in the upper right corner was October 2013. 12 years. Constance withdrew her hands from the table and hid them in her lap, as if the envelope might burn her. "Why didn't you open it?" she asked in a voice that was no longer hard but fragile, like fine glass someone holds with too much force. "Because I was afraid," Eleanor confessed. "Afraid of what you said in there. Afraid you'd ask me to stay, because then I would have had to explain why I couldn't, and I wasn't ready for that." "And now you are?" "No, but I can't keep carrying this alone." Silence settled between them again, denser than before. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease, and the bells of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist rang 7 times, marking an hour that neither of them registered. Constance stood from the table. 10 minutes, Eleanor. 3 are already gone. But she did not ask her to leave. And Eleanor, who knew this woman better than she knew any other person in the world, understood that those 10 minutes were a merciful lie. Constance was not going to throw her out. Not yet. Not while that envelope sat on the table, sealed, full of words neither of them had read. What neither of them knew, what they did not even suspect, was that the envelope contained far more than a farewell letter. It contained a truth Constance had written in a moment of desperation, a truth she had tried to erase from her memory for 12 years, a truth that, once read, would change absolutely everything they believed about the night Eleanor disappeared. But that would come later. For now, 2 drenched women stared at each other across a table in a Savannah apartment, with a sealed letter between them and the weight of 12 years crushing their chests. And outside, the rain stopped. Constance stood by the window and watched the cobblestones of East Jones Street glisten with fresh rainwater. The gas street lamps had flickered on and cast amber halos over the puddles, giving the neighborhood that antique postcard look that drew so many tourists, and that to her, after so many years, felt more like a beautiful prison than a home. "Where are you staying?" she asked without turning around. "I don't have anywhere to stay," Eleanor replied. "I came straight from the airport. I didn't book anything." Constance clenched her jaw. It was a gesture she made when she needed to control an emotion she considered beneath her. Compassion, for instance, or tenderness. "There's a bed and breakfast on Whitaker Street. Clean, affordable. 3 blocks from here. I can find something, but first I need us to talk." "We're talking," Constance shot back, turning at last. "And every word you say confirms you haven't changed at all. You still show up without a plan, without warning, expecting the world to rearrange itself around you." The blow was precise, but Eleanor did not flinch. She sat with her back straight, holding Constance's gaze with a steadiness the other woman did not recognize. The Eleanor who had left 12 years ago was softer, more fearful, more willing to yield. This Eleanor had something different in her eyes. Not hardness exactly, but the particular calm of someone who has hit bottom and discovered that the bottom, after all, is a place from which you can push upward. "You're right," Eleanor said. "I haven't planned anything. But there is one thing I did decide, and that is, I'm not leaving until you read that letter." Constance looked at the envelope on the table as if it were a venomous creature. "I don't want to read it. You wrote it. Exactly. I know what it says. And I don't want to go back to that version of myself." "You don't know what it says, Constance, because you never knew whether I read it or not. You spent 12 years not knowing if those words reached me or got lost. Now you know. They never reached me. They're there, untouched. And I need you to read them aloud, with me present, so I can understand what I missed. If this doesn't deserve a like, I don't know what does." Constance crossed her arms. It was her combat stance, the one she assumed when the world demanded something she was unwilling to give. "And then what? I read the letter, you cry, you hug me, and we pretend 12 years never happened?" "No. You read the letter, and then I tell you why I left." That stopped Constance. In 12 years, no one, not her mother, not her friends, not the therapist she had stopped seeing 3 years ago, had been able to give her that answer. The reason, the motive, the explanation that was missing to close a chapter that had been open like an exposed wound since that October dawn. She sat down, not in the chair at the table, but on the armchair by the window, 10 feet away from Eleanor, as if she needed distance to process what she was hearing. "Why now?" she asked. "Of all the nights, of all the months, of all the years, why now?" "Because my father died," Eleanor said. And her voice, which until that moment had held firm, fractured on the last syllable like a dry branch someone steps on. Constance opened her mouth and closed it. She had not expected that. She knew Eleanor's father, Robert Caldwell, was a difficult man. A retired engineer with rigid ideas about how the women in his family should live. But death was not in the script Constance had imagined for this night. "When?" she asked. "6 weeks ago. A heart attack. It was quick. He didn't suffer, according to the doctors." Eleanor rubbed her eyes with a rough gesture, as if swatting something away. "After the funeral, I went through some boxes with his things, and among those boxes were documents, letters, phone records, and I discovered that my father knew. He always knew." "Knew what?" Constance asked, but she already knew. She could feel it coming the way you feel a storm when the air changes its smell. "He knew about us," Eleanor said. "He knew you and I were not just friends. He knew what we were. And he was the one who forced me to leave." The apartment fell into a silence so deep you could hear the drip of the kitchen faucet Constance had never gotten around to fixing. Plock, plock, plock. Like a metronome measuring the time between revelation and reaction. Constance did not move, did not speak. She sat in the armchair with her hands on her knees, and her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor she probably was not even seeing. "He forced you?" she repeated at last, and each syllable came out as if she were chewing it. "Your father forced you to leave?" "He gave me a week to disappear, or he would tell your whole family. Your mother, your brother James, the neighbors, the people at the gallery where you were just getting started. He said that if I didn't leave, he would make sure all of Savannah knew what we were. In 2013, Constance, in this neighborhood, with these families, with these last names. You know what that would have meant." Constance knew. She knew with painful clarity, because in 2013 she herself had not been able to tell the truth to her own mother. They lived in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where Sundays meant services at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, and gossip traveled faster than the trolley. A beautiful neighborhood, cultured, full of artists and academics who talked about freedom in the bars on Congress Street, but raised their children by the same old rules. And her mother, Miss Alice, was a good woman, but a traditional one, with a rosary by her bedside and saints in every corner of the apartment, who adored Eleanor as if she were her second daughter, and never, never suspected that between them there was anything more than a deep friendship. "So you left," Constance said slowly. "You left to protect me." "I left to protect you," Eleanor confirmed. "And to protect my mother, who depended on my father financially and wouldn't have survived the scandal. And to protect myself, because in that moment I didn't have the strength to face it. I was 27, Constance. I was scared. I was so scared I couldn't even say goodbye." Constance brought her hand to her mouth, not to hold back a sob, she wasn't there yet, but to hold back the rage. Because rage, in that moment, was stronger than sadness. Rage at Robert Caldwell, who had died 6 weeks earlier and could no longer answer for what he did. Rage at Eleanor, who had chosen silence instead of truth. And rage at herself, at that 29-year-old Constance who had let an unexplained disappearance destroy her, who had spent months unable to sleep, who had lost 15 pounds, who had stopped painting for nearly 2 years, who had turned her life into a fortress where no one else could ever enter, and hurt her like that again. "And the letter?" she asked, her voice raw. "If your father threatened you, if it was already decided, why didn't you open my letter?" "Because I knew that if I read it, I wouldn't be able to leave. And I had to leave. Or at least that's what I believed. Constance stood and walked to the table. She stood in front of the envelope, staring at it with an intensity that was almost physical, as if she could see through the paper. I wrote that letter the night of October 17th, 2013, she said quietly. You and I had fought. I don't remember why. Something trivial, like always. And after you fell asleep, I stayed up thinking about everything I wasn't able to say out loud. And I wrote it, all of it, every feeling, every fear, every wish, every piece of the future I imagined with you. I slipped it under your pillow because I wanted you to find it when you woke up, to read it with your morning coffee, to know exactly where you stood in my life. Eleanor lowered her gaze. I found it, she said, but not with the morning coffee. I found it at 4 a.m, while I was shoving my things into a backpack with shaking hands, and I tucked it into my jacket pocket because it was the only piece of you I could take without anyone knowing. Constance picked up the envelope, turned it in her hands, ran her finger along the sealed edge that was still intact after 12 years. I'm going to open it, she said. Now or never, Eleanor replied. Constance tore the envelope open with one clean motion. Inside were 2 sheets of paper folded in thirds, written on both sides with blue ink, the ink from the fountain pens she used then and still used now. She unfolded the pages and smoothed them on the table with her palms, the way one smooths the surface of something sacred before confronting it. She began reading in silence. Eleanor did not move. She watched Constance's face the way one watches a sky before a storm, searching for signals, anticipating lightning. Constance read, and her eyes kept changing, from initial tension to surprise, from surprise to something that resembled pain, but ran deeper, older, like touching a scar you thought had healed and discovering there is still raw nerve beneath. When she finished, she set the pages on the table and stared at the wall, very still, jaw clenched. What does it say? Eleanor asked. It's not what I remembered, Constance answered. What did you remember? I remembered saying goodbye. I remembered writing a love letter, a declaration, something beautiful and final. But that's not what this says. What does it say? Constance looked at her with bright, wet, defiant eyes. It says I knew you were going to leave. It says I'd been noticing for weeks that something was wrong. That your father had called me in secret 2 weeks before and told me things I never told you. The air stopped. Eleanor rose to her feet. What? She said, and her voice sounded as if someone had knocked all the air from her body. My father called you? Yes, Constance said, and now the tears began to fall, silent, down her cheeks, but her voice stayed steady. He called me on October 3rd, 2013, 2 weeks before you disappeared. He told me exactly what he told you, that he knew everything, that he would destroy us if we didn't separate. But he gave me a different option. What option? He told me that if I convinced you I didn't love you, if I made you believe that what we had was a mistake, you would leave on your own, and he wouldn't have to intervene. He said it would be cleaner that way, that if you believed I didn't feel the same, you'd go without a fight. Eleanor took a step back. She physically stepped back, as if the words were a shove. No, she murmured. The argument, the night of the 17th. You started saying terrible things, that you weren't sure what you felt, that maybe we'd confused ourselves, that you needed space. You thought it was real, Constance finished, her voice broken. You thought I was leaving you, and that was exactly what your father wanted you to think. But I couldn't go through with it, Eleanor. I couldn't finish. That's why I wrote the letter. Because after that fight, I regretted every word I'd said and needed you to know the truth. That it was all a lie, that your father was manipulating me, that every word that night was a script he forced me to follow. But you never read it. You left believing I didn't love you. And 12 years of misunderstanding collapsed onto that table like a building falling in slow motion, brick by brick, truth by truth. If any part of this story looks like your life, the hype button makes sure it doesn't go unheard. Eleanor let herself drop into the chair, not with drama, but with exhaustion, like someone who has been holding an impossible weight for years and suddenly discovers that what she was holding was a lie. 12 years, she said in a whisper. 12 years thinking you didn't want me, that you'd said it to my face, and the letter was your way of saying goodbye. And I spent 12 years thinking you'd read the letter and left anyway, Constance replied. That you'd read the whole truth and chosen to leave regardless. The magnitude of what Robert Caldwell had done spread between them like an ink stain that would not stop growing. He had manipulated both of them, separately. With the same threat, but different tools. He had threatened Eleanor directly, and he had turned Constance into an unwilling accomplice in the separation. A clean, calculated design that needed only one thing to work, that neither of them would speak to the other. And it had worked, for 12 years. Constance sat down again, no longer in the distant armchair, but in the chair across from Eleanor, on the other side of the table, an arm's length away. The pages of the letter lay between them, open, unfolded, with blue ink that had faded slightly, but was still legible. "Can I read it?" Eleanor asked, gesturing at the pages. "It's yours. It was always yours." Eleanor took the pages with hands that no longer trembled. She began to read, and as she read, her face changed in the same way Constance's had changed minutes before, but in the opposite direction. Where Constance had found rage, Eleanor found solace. Where Constance had seen betrayal, Eleanor saw proof of love. The same letter, read by two different women at two different moments of the same night, produced opposite effects, like a medicine that cures one and poisons the other. When she finished, Eleanor set the pages on the table and looked at Constance with eyes full of something that did not yet have a name. "You wrote that you loved me," she said. "It was true. You wrote that you were scared but willing to fight. That was true too. You wrote that no matter what happened, you would wait for me." Constance closed her eyes. "That was also true, Eleanor. But you can't ask me to keep a promise I made at 29, in a letter I thought you had read and rejected. I'm not that person anymore. I can't be that person anymore." "I'm not asking you to be that person," Eleanor said. "I'm asking you to let me get to know the person you are now." Constance opened her eyes, and in that moment, for the first time all night, something softened in her gaze. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was a vast and distant territory they were not yet ready to explore. But it was something like a door cracking open, just a sliver, just enough to let in a little light. "Not tonight," Constance said. "Tonight is too much. I need to think. I need to be alone. I need to process that the man who smiled at me every Sunday at church was the same man who called me on the phone and threatened to destroy my life if I didn't destroy yours first." Eleanor nodded. She did not insist. The Eleanor of 27 would have insisted, would have begged, would have turned that moment into a scene. But this Eleanor understood something that can only be learned through years and through pain. That respecting someone else's timing is the highest form of love. She stood, picked up her suitcase, and walked to the door. "Eleanor," Constance called when she already had her hand on the knob. "Yes?" "The bed and breakfast on Whitaker Street is called the Magnolia Inn." Tell Miss Birdie you're coming on my behalf. She'll give you a good rate." Eleanor smiled for the first time all night. It was a small, restrained smile, like a seed that does not yet know whether the ground where it landed will let it grow. "Thank you, Constance." "Don't thank me," Constance repeated. "And stop saying thank you. I never liked you thanking me for things I do because I want to, not because you asked." "That hasn't changed," Eleanor observed. "Some things don't change," Constance replied. And buried in that sentence, beneath layers of caution and pain, was a confession that both of them heard, but neither dared to name. Eleanor stepped into the hallway, descended the stairs, and crossed the courtyard where the fountain was still dry, and the rain puddles reflected the stars beginning to peek through the clouds. Miss Dorothy watched her pass from her window and crossed herself in silence, not because she believed in ghosts, but because she knew that what was happening in that townhouse was the kind of thing that only happens once in a lifetime, the return of someone who had already been buried in memory. Eleanor walked down East Jones Street toward Whitaker, her suitcase rolling over the wet cobblestones, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the quiet Savannah night. In her pocket she carried the letter, now read, folded again but without the seal, like a wound that has finally been opened and cleaned. And as she walked, she thought of something her father had told her once, years before everything fell apart, on one of those Sunday afternoons when the old man would turn philosophical after his second bourbon. "The worst prisons, sweetheart, are the ones you build to protect other people." Robert Caldwell had been right, except he wasn't talking about other people's prisons. He was talking about his own. Eleanor reached the inn, asked for a room, lay down on a bed that smelled of lavender and cheap fabric softener, and stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to the sounds of Savannah drifting through the open window. A dog barking in the distance, jazz from a bar on Congress Street, the murmur of a couple walking past, talking softly. In the apartment on East Jones Street, Constance was reading the letter for the third time, sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator, crying without sound, a cup of cold coffee beside her, and the certainty that the world she had built with such patience had just received its first crack. And cracks, as she knew well from her work with ceramics and antique art, could be one of two things: the beginning of destruction, or the place where the light gets in. She did not yet know which one this would be. Eleanor woke to the sound of church bells, that deep, resonant chime that rolls across Savannah every morning from the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, a sound that seems to come from another century, and that at 8 in the morning slips through the open windows of bed and breakfasts in the historic district, like a gentle ghost that doesn't know nobody is waiting for it anymore. She opened her eyes and for 3 seconds did not know where she was. The ceiling was white, with a crack running diagonally across it like a dry riverbed on a map. The air smelled of industrial lavender and fresh biscuits rising from a kitchen somewhere below. Then she remembered. She sat up in bed with the weight of the previous night falling on her like a sack of cement. The letter. The confession. Constance's face shifting from rage to pain to something without a name. And the image, branded into her memory, of Constance saying, "Your father called me." She showered with water that took 3 minutes to warm and dressed in clean clothes from the suitcase. Dark jeans, a cream-colored blouse, flat shoes she had bought in Charlotte thinking of Savannah's cobblestones, as though some part of her had always known she would come back. She went down to the small dining room, where Miss Birdie, a stout woman with auburn-dyed hair and a floral apron, served her strong coffee and a plate of shrimp and grits without asking if she wanted them. "Constance told me you were coming," Miss Birdie remarked, while wiping the counter with a damp rag. "Well, she didn't exactly say that. She texted me at 11 at night. Someone's arriving. Put her in the back room." That woman never uses more words than necessary. Eleanor managed a half smile. "Do you know her well?" "Known her since she came to Savannah, about 15 years now. I rent her the room when visiting artists come for her gallery shows. Good customer. pays on time, keeps quiet, and brings me pecan pie every Thanksgiving. Can't ask for more than that from anyone. Do you know if she has someone?" The question escaped before Eleanor could stop it, and she regretted it instantly, because it was a question that revealed too much. Miss Birdie looked at her with the eyes of a woman who has spent decades watching people come through her establishment and has learned to read entire stories in a single question. "That," she said firmly but without malice, "is something you ask her yourself." Eleanor nodded and did not push further. She ate the grits in silence, left a generous tip on the counter, and stepped outside. Morning Savannah was another world. The previous night's downpour had washed everything clean, and the streets gleamed with that damp freshness that lasts only a few hours before the dust and traffic reclaim the city. The trees still dripped, newspaper vendors arranged their stands by the squares, a woman swept the sidewalk in front of her house with a straw broom, while a tabby cat stretched on a wall draped in purple wisteria. Eleanor walked without a clear destination, though her feet carried her toward East Jones Street, as if they had a memory of their own. She passed the Telfair Academy, the old bookshop on Bull Street, where she and Constance had spent entire afternoons sitting on the floor between shelves, reading in silence with their knees touching, and that minimal contact, knee against knee through the fabric of their pants, had been enough to make the outside world cease to exist. She stopped in front of the Forsyth Gallery, housed in a restored Victorian on Broughton Street. The sign was new, gold letters on a black background, and in the display window was a series of large-format photographs. Hands. Hands of women working, cooking, sewing, caressing, holding tools, holding babies, holding earth. Beneath each image, a small plaque. Hands that hold the world, photographs by Constance Rivers. Permanent exhibition. Eleanor stood staring at the photographs through the glass for several minutes. She recognized the style immediately. That way Constance had of capturing dignity in the everyday, of finding beauty without forcing it, of making the ordinary seem epic without any tricks. She had improved, considerably. The Constance of 12 years ago had talent. The Constance of now had mastery. The gallery door opened, and out came a young man with round glasses, a denim apron, and a coffee cup in his hand. "Can I help you? We don't open until 11, but you're welcome to see the garden exhibit. That one's open all day," he said pleasantly. "No, thank you. I was just looking. Is Constance here?" The young man assessed her with a quick, professional glance, as if deciding whether this woman was a journalist, a client, or trouble. "Constance doesn't come in until noon on Thursdays. Would you like to leave a message?" "No, I'll come back later." Eleanor kept walking. She needed to think, and to think she needed to move. It had always been that way. Ideas came to her better when she was in motion, as if thoughts needed the rhythm of footsteps to arrange themselves. She crossed Monterey Square, passed through Forsyth Park where vendors were already setting up their craft tables beneath the live oaks, bought a sweet tea from a sidewalk stand, and sat on a bench near the fountain. And there, with the cup warming her hands and the noise of the city waking around her, Eleanor did what she had avoided doing all night. She thought about her father. Robert Caldwell had been a man of brutal contrasts. A civil engineer by profession, a churchgoer by habit, a father with a heavy hand and a guarded heart that only softened at Christmas and after his third bourbon. He had built bridges across rivers all over Georgia and had not been able to build one toward his own daughter. He loved her, Eleanor never doubted that. But he loved her with the kind of love that demands obedience in exchange for protection, a love that resembles a contract more than an affection. When Eleanor was 24 and began spending more and more time at Constance's apartment in Savannah, Robert said nothing. When Eleanor stopped mentioning boyfriends and spoke only of her friend Constance, Robert clenched his jaw but kept quiet. When someone, Eleanor never learned who, told Robert what his daughter was and who she was with, the old man did not shout, did not confront, did not cause a scene. He did something worse. He planned. He called Constance first, gave her instructions. Then he waited 2 weeks and delivered the final blow to Eleanor. Disappear, or I destroy everything. A perfect chess move. Sacrifice one piece to control the other two. And it worked, because neither of them talked to the other. Because fear is the most effective silencer there is. Eleanor finished the tea and crushed the cup in her hands. She felt no hatred toward her father. Hatred requires energy, and she had spent all of hers years ago. But she felt something worse. A vast, gray disappointment. Like a field after a fire, where nothing remains that can burn. At 12:15, Eleanor stood in front of the Forsyth Gallery. The door was open, and from inside came the scent of wood and fresh coffee. She walked in. The space was wide, with polished concrete floors, white walls, and high ceilings where light entered through rectangular skylights that distributed an even clarity over the photographs on display. There were 3 rooms. The first held the hand series Eleanor had seen from outside. The second held landscapes of the Georgia coast and the Appalachian foothills. And the third, the smallest, almost intimate, held portraits. Eleanor stopped in the 3rd room. The portraits were of older women, market vendors, midwives, rural teachers, church deaconesses. Each face told an entire life. The wrinkles were neither softened nor idealized. They were illuminated in a way that turned them into maps of experience, into proof of survival. Beneath each portrait, a phrase handwritten by the subject. I didn't give up because my children wouldn't let me. I'm still here because somebody has to open the shop every morning. I survived because I'm more stubborn than life itself. You shouldn't be here. Constance's voice came from the doorway of the room, dry and controlled, like someone who has had all morning to prepare her armor. Eleanor turned. Constance stood in the threshold, dressed in black pants, a gray linen blouse, and a long necklace of turquoise beads that hung to the middle of her chest. Her hair was gathered in a messy bun that revealed her long neck and the line of her jaw, which was still the same obstinate jaw Eleanor remembered. But there was something new. A confidence in her posture, a solidity in the way she occupied space, that the younger Constance had not possessed. Your gallery is incredible, Eleanor said. It's not mine. I'm the curator. The gallery belongs to an artists' collective I'm part of. Your photos are incredible, then. You didn't come to talk about photos. No, but that doesn't make it any less true. Constance crossed her arms, that gesture Eleanor already recognized as her shield, and walked to the center of the room, keeping distance. I didn't sleep last night, Constance confessed. I reread the letter 5 times. Then I put it in the nightstand drawer, next to my reading glasses and the migraine pills. I made chamomile tea that didn't help at all. I sat on the porch and smoked a cigarette, which was the first in 3 years. And I thought, what did you think about? That I have questions, a lot of them, and I won't be able to live with them inside me. Ask. Constance fixed her gaze on Eleanor, measuring, calculating, as though each question were a bullet, and she wanted to make sure she used the most precise ones first. Was there someone else? She asked. In these 12 years, was there someone else? The question fell like a stone into still water. Eleanor did not look away. There was one person, she replied. In Charlotte, 5 years ago. Her name is Patricia. It lasted 11 months. 11 months, Constance repeated, her voice betraying nothing about whether that seemed like a lot or a little. 11 months during which I tried to convince myself I could start over. Patricia is a good person. She teaches at a university. She's smart, funny, kind. She didn't resemble you in any way. And I think that's why I chose her. And what happened? One day I woke up next to her and the first thing I thought about was you. And I knew it wasn't fair to her. I told her. It was painful, but it was honest. Constance uncrossed her arms. Not because she felt safer, but because she needed her hands free for what she was about to ask. "What about you?" Eleanor asked before Constance could formulate the next question. "Was there someone?" Constance took a long time to answer. She walked to one of the photographs on the wall, the portrait of an older woman with braids and clear eyes, and stood looking at it as if the answer were there. "There were attempts," she said at last. 3. None lasted more than 4 months. The first was an artist I met at a residency in Asheville. The second, an architect who lived here in Savannah. The third, an editor I met at a book fair in Atlanta. What happened with them? "I was broken," Constance said with a frankness that stung. "And nobody wants to be with someone who carries the ghost of another person into every conversation, every dinner, every silence. It wasn't fair to them. It wasn't fair to me. So I stopped trying. I focused on work, on the photos, on the gallery. I built a life that works, Eleanor. It works without holes, without crises, without sleepless nights. Is it the life I dreamed of? No. But it's mine. And now here you come, shaking it like a tablecloth you can just pick up and lay back down. I don't want to shake anything. You already did. Last night when you knocked on my door, you already did. You can't undo that." The young man with the round glasses poked his head through the doorway. "Constance, the woman from the St. Simon's Collective is on the phone. She says the frames for Friday's show are urgent. Tell her I'll call back in 10 minutes, Ryan," Constance replied, without taking her eyes off Eleanor. Ryan nodded and disappeared, but his interruption had changed something in the air. It had reminded them that outside this room, there existed a world of frames and exhibitions and urgent phone calls, a world that did not stop because 2 women were standing face to face, untangling 12 years of silence. "I need to ask you something," Constance said, "and I need you to respect it. Tell me. I need time. I'm not saying no. I'm not saying yes. I'm saying I need to process this without your presence pushing me to feel things I'm not ready for. Can you give me that?" "How much time?" "I don't know. A few days? A week? I don't know. I'll stay at the inn. I'll be here in Savannah for as long as you need. But I need you to know one thing. I didn't come to win you back. I came to return the truth to you. What happens after that is your decision." Constance studied her for a long moment, searching for the trap in those words, the hidden angle, the manipulation. She found nothing. And that, paradoxically, scared her more than finding a lie would have, because it meant Eleanor was being sincere, and Eleanor's sincerity had always been the most dangerous thing in the world for the stability of Constance Rivers. "All right," she said. "Stay at the inn. But don't come to the gallery. Don't look for me. When I'm ready, I'll come to you." Eleanor nodded. She turned and walked toward the exit. But before crossing the threshold, she stopped in front of the portrait of the braided woman Constance had been looking at. She read the handwritten phrase beneath it. "I survived, because I'm more stubborn than life itself." "I like that one," she said without turning around. "So do I," Constance replied from the far end of the room. "It reminds me of someone." Eleanor left the gallery without responding, but she carried a smile tucked behind her lips that she did not allow herself to show until she was on the street, away from Constance's gaze, walking among the people of Savannah who came and went with their shopping bags and their normal lives and their everyday problems, completely unaware of the silent earthquake that was occurring just yards away, inside a gallery with white walls and photographs of hands that hold the world. The days that followed were long and strange. Eleanor kept her promise. She did not seek out Constance. She stayed at the inn, in that back room that smelled of lavender and opened onto an interior courtyard with an old magnolia tree that still dropped its heavy blossoms. She had breakfast with Miss Birdie, who turned out to be an inexhaustible source of information about the neighborhood and its residents, though she never, not once, spoke of Constance again, unless Eleanor brought her up first. Eleanor spent the mornings walking. She wandered the streets of Savannah the way one wanders the pages of a book read long ago, of which only fragments remain. Here was the cafe where we had dinner on Fridays. Here the ice cream shop where Constance once ordered a peach cone and dropped it on the ground and laughed so hard tears came. Here the bench in the park where we held hands for the first time. A June night that smelled of jasmine and fear. Every corner was a personal museum, every street a corridor of memories that hurt but also, in some way, held her up. The afternoon she spent reading in Forsyth Park or at the public library on Bull Street, seated by the tall windows with a book in her hands and her mind somewhere else. Sometimes she wrote in a small notebook she had bought at a stationery shop on Abercorn Street. Not exactly a journal, but fragments, loose sentences, ideas that needed to leave her head to stop spinning. On the third day, while eating a shrimp po' boy at the city market, seated at a high counter in front of a food stall where the fryer hissed with oil and the women behind the counter served plates with the speed and precision of an assembly line, someone sat down beside her. "You're the one who came back," said a female voice to her left. Eleanor turned her head. She saw a woman in her 50s, with short hair, dyed a fierce red, enormous silver earrings, and a smile that was half curiosity, half warning. She wore a paint-splattered linen shirt and carried a canvas bag overflowing with vegetables from the market and a bunch of fresh basil poking out the top like a green flag. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" Eleanor asked. "Not directly. I'm Marlene Hayes. I work with Constance at the gallery. I'm a painter and a sculptor when the clay cooperates. Constance and I have been friends for 8 years, and in 8 years I've seen her go through a lot of things, but I've never seen her like I saw her yesterday." Eleanor set the po' boy down on the plate. "How did she look?" "Scared," Marlene said without preamble. "And Constance Rivers doesn't scare easily. That woman has handled international exhibitions, negotiated with European collectors who could make a grown man cry, pulled the gallery through a pandemic and 2 economic downturns. But yesterday, she was sitting in her office staring at the wall with the face of someone who's just received a diagnosis they weren't expecting." Eleanor didn't know what to say. Marlene continued, "I'm not here to judge you. I don't know what happened between you two, and it's not my place to know. But I will tell you this. That woman built something valuable. Not just the gallery, but herself. She rebuilt herself piece by piece, like those Japanese bowls they mend with gold. Do you know kintsugi?" "Yes." "Well, Constance is that. She's whole, but the scars are there, visible, and she's turned them into part of her beauty. If you've come to break her again, I'm telling you with all due respect, I won't let that happen." The declaration was direct, without hostility, but without room for ambiguity. Eleanor looked into her eyes and saw something she recognized: loyalty. The kind of loyalty that is earned through years of presence, of calls at 3 a.m, of glasses of wine shared after a bad day. "I didn't come to break anything, Marlene," Eleanor said firmly. "I came to return something that belongs to her. What she does with it is her decision." Marlene assessed her for a long moment, like a sculptor examining a block of stone before deciding whether it's worth carving. "All right," she said at last. "I believe you. For now. But I'll be watching." She stood, adjusted her canvas bag, and before leaving, turned one last time. "One more thing. If Constance reaches out to you, don't make her wait. That woman takes years to decide to take a step. But when she takes it, it's now or never." Marlene disappeared among the market stalls, leaving behind a scent of basil and a warning that Eleanor stored the way you store the instructions for something important. That night, at the inn, Eleanor ate alone in the empty dining room. A bowl of she-crab soup that Miss Birdie had left for her before heading home, and then went up to her room. She sat on the bed, pulled out her phone, and searched for Constance's name on social media. She didn't find her. Constance had no profile on any platform, which did not surprise Eleanor in the slightest. Constance had always distrusted the exposed life, the need to display, turning the private into public. But the gallery did have a profile, and on it were photos of events, openings, workshops, and in some of those photos Constance appeared. In a corner, wine glass in hand, talking to someone, behind a table during a children's workshop, in front of a camera on a tripod, mid-shoot. In every image she looked complete, professional, assured. The kind of woman who has learned to be enough for herself and who doesn't need anyone to hold her up. And that, Eleanor thought as she closed the phone and turned off the light, was the most terrifying thing of all. Because a Constance who needed her would be easier to reach, but a Constance who didn't need her, that was a woman who could only be reached if she chose to open the door. And the door, for now, remained shut. 4 days passed. 4 days without a word from Constance. On the 5th day, while Eleanor sipped coffee on a bench in Forsyth Park, beneath an October sun that warmed without burning, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Forsyth Park. The bench by the old oak near the south fountain. Tomorrow at 10. Come alone." It didn't say who it was from. It didn't need to. Forsyth Park in the morning is one of those places that mean different things to different people. For tourists, it's a photo opportunity. The white fountain, the canopy of live oaks, the runners on the paths. For the people of Savannah, it's part of the landscape, as familiar as the river or the cathedral bells. For Constance and Eleanor, during the 3 years they lived together, it had been their meeting point, their refuge, their neutral ground. They would sit on a particular bench beneath a massive live oak near the south fountain, hidden from view by a curtain of Spanish moss, so thick it was like sitting inside a green room, woven by the trees themselves. And there, they would talk about everything and nothing, with the intimacy that is only possible when you know nobody is watching. Eleanor arrived at 9:45. She bought a coffee from the stand by the park entrance, walked the winding path past joggers and dog walkers, and made her way to their bench beneath the old oak. Constance was already there. She was sitting on the bench with her legs crossed, wearing a white linen dress and a denim jacket, eyes closed, face tilted up toward the sun filtering through the Spanish moss. She didn't look at peace exactly, but she looked like someone in a truce, someone who had stopped fighting herself, at least for a little while. "You're early," she said, without opening her eyes. "So are you," Eleanor replied. "I didn't arrive early. I was already here. I came at 8, when the park was still empty. I needed to be here before you, so it wouldn't feel like I was arriving on your territory." "This was always our territory." "It was," Constance corrected, opening her eyes. "It was our territory. Now it's a park where 500 tourists take selfies with the fountain every day. Things change." Eleanor sat on the bench, a foot of space between them, and that foot felt like both a canyon and a promise. "5 days, Eleanor said. "I thought you weren't going to write." "I almost didn't," Last night at 11, I was about to delete the message, but I'd already sent it. Why did you almost not write? Constance took a while to answer. She picked a dry leaf from the armrest and began tearing it into small pieces while she spoke, as if she needed to do something with her hands to be honest. Because I'm afraid, she said. And that makes me angry, because I shouldn't still be afraid of you. I went through the grief, the therapy, the bad nights, all of it. I did the work, Eleanor. I did every damn bit of the work of healing. And then you appear with a letter and an explanation, and suddenly all that work seems fragile, like one breath could knock it down. And did it fall? No, but it shifted. And feeling it shift reminds me of what the earthquake felt like, and I don't like that. The park was nearly empty at that hour. A couple of tourists photographed the fountain from across the lawn, and a gray squirrel ran along the top of the iron fence with the casual confidence that only Savannah's park squirrels possess. I have questions, Constance said. Ask. Does your mother know you're here? Yes. I called her before catching the flight from Charlotte. I told her I was coming to Savannah to settle something unfinished. I didn't say what. And does she know about your father? What he did? Yes. I told her after the funeral, when I found the documents. She didn't believe me at first. Then she cried. Then she asked for my forgiveness, as if she'd had anything to do with it. My mother always apologizes for things she didn't do. And your brother? David doesn't know anything. David lives in Jacksonville with his wife and 3 kids and thinks I left Savannah because I got a better job offer in Charlotte. That's what my father told everyone, and nobody questioned it. Constance stopped tearing the leaf. The pieces lay scattered on her lap like sad confetti. Do you know what hurts me the most? She asked, and her voice shifted register, became lower, rawer. It's not that your father separated us. That's terrible, but it's understandable. He was a man of his time, with his fears and his prejudices. What hurts the most is that you listened to him, that you chose me as the person who needed protecting, without asking me if I wanted that protection. You decided for me, Eleanor. You decided I wasn't strong enough to face the truth. Eleanor absorbed the blow in silence, because it was fair, because it was true. We were 29, Constance continued. I was 29. We weren't children. If you had told me what was happening, if you had shown me your father's claws, we could have decided together. Maybe we would have reached the same conclusion, to separate, or maybe not. But it would have been our decision, not his. And I wouldn't have spent 12 years asking myself what I did wrong. Nothing, Eleanor said, and her voice cracked. You did nothing wrong. You never did anything wrong. I know that now. But I didn't know it for 12 years. Do you have any idea what it's like to live asking yourself what you did to make the person you loved most in the world vanish without a word? Do you have any idea how many nights I spent replaying every conversation, every gesture, every argument, searching for the exact moment I failed? The day I said the wrong thing? The time I wasn't enough? The words came out of Constance like water from a dam that has finally cracked. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't crying. She spoke with the painful precision of someone who has rehearsed this speech in her mind for years, waiting for the chance to deliver it. I went to therapy for 3 years, she continued. 3 years sitting in front of a woman who asked me how I felt, and I always answered the same thing. Abandoned. That was my word. Abandoned. And now it turns out I wasn't abandoned. I was protected. How am I supposed to process that? How do I go from she left because she didn't love me to she left because she loved me too much? It's the same pain in different wrapping, and I don't know what to do with it." The gray squirrel had come closer and sat between them on the bench, grooming itself with absolute disinterest. Constance glanced at it, and then turned back to Eleanor. "I'm not asking you to fix this. You can't. Nobody can. I'm just telling you what I need you to hear." "I'm hearing you," Eleanor said. "And you're right about all of it. I decided for you. I chose the path that seemed less painful in the moment and didn't measure the consequences. I didn't think about what my silence would do to you. I only thought about what the truth would cost you, and that was a mistake. My mistake, not my father's. He set the trap, but I fell into it out of cowardice. And that's something I'll live with for the rest of my life." The sun had climbed, and now fell directly on the park, warming the stones and the iron benches and the Spanish moss that swayed in a gentle breeze. The air smelled of damp earth and the dried magnolia petals that were beginning to carpet the paths as autumn deepened. Constance closed her eyes again and let the sun warm her face. She looked exhausted, like someone who has run an emotional marathon and just crossed a finish line she doesn't yet know is the last or only an intermediate one. "Marlene went looking for you," she said suddenly. "Yes, at the city market." "I know, she told me. She said she liked you, which is a problem, because Marlene is my alarm system, and if she likes you, it means she can't protect me from you." "You don't need protection from me, Constance." That's exactly what someone I need protection from would say. And there, for the first time since Eleanor had arrived in Savannah, Constance smiled. It was a small, cautious, lopsided smile, more on one side than the other, but it was a smile. And Eleanor received it the way you receive the first ray of sun after a week of rain, with relief and with the certainty that it might still rain again. If you want to know what happened after this smile, leave it in the comments. That's the only way I'll know you want more. They stayed on the bench until past noon. They didn't talk the whole time. There were long silences in which they simply existed beside each other, listening to the sounds of the park. Footsteps, the distant laughter of children, the coo of pigeons, watching the sky and the trees and the squirrel that came and went on its own agenda. At some point, Constance began talking about the last 12 years. Not as a chronological account, but as fragments, loose images, vignettes of a life Eleanor had missed. She talked about how she started at the gallery as an assistant, hanging paintings and organizing files, and how in 5 years she became lead curator. She talked about the first exhibition she organized alone, a show of textile art by artisans from Appalachia, and how every piece sold within 2 weeks. She talked about the pandemic, about the months locked in her apartment editing photos while the world stopped, about how the silence of quarantine reminded her of the silence Eleanor had left behind. But this time the silence belonged to everyone, not just her, and that made it more bearable. She talked about her mother, Miss Alice, who still lived in the apartment below, slower than before but just as firm, with her rosary and her saints, and her habit of leaving a plate of food at Constance's door every evening, whether her daughter was home or not. "I never told her," Constance confessed. "Mom doesn't know. She thinks you and I were friends and that you left for work. And when she asked why we stopped talking, I told her we drifted apart, the way friendships do." "And she believed that?" "My mother believes what she needs to believe to sleep at night. She's not foolish. I think on some level she suspects. But she's never asked, and I've never offered." "And if she finds out?" Constance shrugged with a gesture that meant to be casual, but carried within it the weight of a question that had haunted her for years. "She's 72, Eleanor. I love her more than anyone in the world, and I don't know if telling her the truth would free her or shatter her. That's something I can't decide right now." Eleanor nodded. She didn't press. She understood there were territories in Constance's life she had no right to enter. At least not yet. At least not without an invitation. When they left the park, the midday sun fell heavily over the streets of Savannah, and the air smelled of the fried chicken from the lunch counter on Drayton Street. They walked together along the sidewalk toward the historic district, with a gap of half a yard between their bodies that was at once an abyss and a promise. "Are you hungry?" Constance asked. "Yes. I know a place, not the old one, a new one. It opened 3 years ago. They have the best low-country boil in Savannah." They walked to a small restaurant on a side street, with wooden tables on the patio and a striped awning that didn't really block anything but gave the illusion of shade. They sat across from each other, ordered the boil, sweet tea, and a basket of cornbread that the waitress brought in a cast-iron skillet. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said while squeezing lemon over her plate. "Another question. Why Forsyth Park? Why there?" Constance bit into a piece of cornbread, chewed slowly, wiped her mouth with a paper napkin before answering. "Because that bench is the only place where you never lied to me," she said. "The apartment has contaminated memories. The gallery is my workspace. The streets belong to everyone. But that bench behind the moss was only ours. And if we're going to try to be honest, I need a place where honesty has history." Eleanor set down her fork and looked at Constance with an intensity the other woman felt like a physical touch. "Did you just say, if we're going to try?" Constance chewed another bite with deliberate slowness. "I said what I said. I don't repeat it. I don't edit it. I don't take it back." And that sentence, spoken between a low-country boil and sweet tea at a wooden table under a striped awning that was good for nothing, was the first brick of something new. Not a reconstruction, because what they'd had no longer existed and could not be rebuilt, but a new construction, with different materials, on ground both of them knew, but that had changed as much as they had. They ate in silence after that, a different silence from the ones before. Not a silence full of unsaid things, but a silence where both of them were processing what had already been said, giving it space, letting it breathe. Like when you open a bottle of wine and let it sit before pouring. After the meal, Constance paid the bill before Eleanor could reach for her wallet. "Don't argue," she warned. "I'm not arguing. Your face is." They walked back toward East Jones Street. At the corner where their paths diverged, Eleanor toward the inn, Constance toward the gallery, they stopped. "Tomorrow I have a gallery opening," Constance said. "Documentary photography, Appalachian women, 7 in the evening. Is that an invitation?" "It's information." "Sounds like an invitation." "Interpret it however you want. But if you come, don't be late. I hate it when people are late." Constance turned and walked toward the gallery with long, decisive strides, not looking back. Eleanor watched her go, silhouetted against the golden afternoon light that bathed the old brick facades, and thought there were few things more beautiful and more terrifying than watching someone you love walk in the opposite direction from you, knowing that this time, there is a real chance she'll come back. She stood on the corner until Constance turned at the end of the block and disappeared behind a wall covered in Confederate jasmine. Then she took a deep breath, put her hands in her pockets, and walked toward the inn, feeling in her chest something she hadn't felt in 12 years, and that took half a block to identify. Hope. Not the naive, blind hope of 27, but an adult, cautious hope that knew perfectly well it could be crushed at any moment and still chose to exist. Like a plant that grows through the cracks in concrete, improbable, stubborn, and for that very reason, extraordinary. That night, at the inn, Eleanor wrote a single sentence in her notebook. She said, "If we're going to try, I don't undo it. I don't edit it. I don't take it back. And she turned off the light with a smile no one saw, but that lit up the room more than any lamp. The Forsyth Gallery at 7 p.m. on a Friday in October was another universe. The interior lights, warm, directional, placed with the precision of someone who understands that the lighting of a photograph is half its meaning, transformed the space into something closer to a cathedral than a gallery. The white walls breathed with the images. 36 portraits of Appalachian women, in formats that ranged from the size of a window to panels of 6 feet, that forced the viewer to tilt their head back to take in the full face. Eleanor arrived at 6:50. Not late, not early. On time, with the exactness of someone who has measured every minute of the day waiting for this moment. She had dressed in the best she had in her suitcase: black slacks, a white button-down with an open collar, and a pair of small silver earrings she had bought that afternoon at a shop on River Street, more out of a need to do something with her hands than vanity. She had looked at herself in the inn's mirror for too long, studying the lines of her face as if searching for something that would convince her she was ready. She didn't find it, but she went anyway. The gallery was starting to fill. There were people from the neighborhood, artists, academics, curious neighbors who came for the free wine and stayed for the photographs. A few collectors Eleanor identified by their expensive shoes and their habit of viewing work through narrowed eyes, and a group of SCAD students taking notes in small notebooks with the seriousness of people discovering the world. Ryan, the young man with the round glasses, recognized her at the entrance. "You came," he said with a half-smile that suggested he knew more than he let on. "Constance is in the back room. The show officially starts in 10 minutes, but you can walk through the photos if you'd like." Eleanor entered and lost herself among the portraits. The women in the photographs looked out from the walls with a presence that was almost physical. A weaver from the Blue Ridge with hands full of colored threads that resembled veins of the earth. A cook from a church kitchen in West Virginia with wood smoke framing her face like a secular halo. A schoolteacher from the hollows of eastern Kentucky with the oldest and yet youngest eyes Eleanor had ever seen, as if that woman had lived 100 years and kept intact the curiosity of a child. Every photograph carried Constance's signature, that ability to capture the exact instant when a person's dignity becomes visible, the moment the body stops posing and simply is. Eleanor stopped in front of one portrait in particular, an elderly woman sitting in a wooden rocking chair on the porch of her clapboard house, a hand-stitched quilt draped over her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking toward some point beyond the frame, toward something only she could see. And in that gaze there was a solitude that was not sad, but sovereign. The solitude of someone who has learned to be her own company and asks nothing from anyone. "Her name is Miss Della," Constance's voice said behind her. "She's 93. Lives alone in a hollow called Rabbit Creek in McDowell County. When I asked if I could photograph her, she said, 'Only if you promise not to make me look pretty.' I'm too old for that nonsense. I promised. And this is the photograph that came out." Eleanor turned. Constance stood 2 yards away, wearing a black tailored suit she'd never seen before. Her hair loose for the first time since Eleanor had arrived in Savannah, and a discreet lipstick that accentuated the line of her mouth without exaggerating it. She was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with the clothes or the makeup, and everything to do with the confidence she projected, the way she inhabited that space as if every square inch of the gallery were an extension of herself. "You came," Constance said, unknowingly repeating Ryan's words, but with an entirely different weight. "You invited me. I gave you information, which I interpreted as an invitation, as you told me I could." The corner of Constance's mouth curved slightly upward. Not a full smile, but something. "Stay. Enjoy the show. There's red wine at the table in the back. After the opening, I need to talk to you." Did something happen? A lot of things happened, but not here. Later. Constance moved away to greet a group of guests who had just arrived, and Eleanor was left alone among the portraits, a glass of red wine in her hand, and her heart beating with the particular frequency it reaches when it knows something important is about to happen, but not whether it will be good or bad. The opening was a success. Constance gave a brief speech, no more than 5 minutes, in which she spoke about the women in the photographs with a contained passion that electrified the air. She talked about how she found them, how she earned their trust, how each session had been a negotiation of vulnerability in which she had to prove herself worthy of truly seeing them. She spoke about the difference between looking and seeing, between capturing and accompanying. And at the end, in a voice that cracked for just a fraction of a second, she said, "These women taught me something I thought I already knew but had forgotten. That vulnerability is not weakness. That letting yourself be truly seen by another human being, without masks, without defenses, is the bravest act there is. This exhibition is for anyone who has ever dared to be seen." Eleanor, standing at the back of the room with her wine glass, felt those words were not just for the audience. They were a coded message, a frequency only she could receive, and she received it with every fiber of her body. The crowd applauded. More wine was poured. The guests circulated among the photographs, commenting, pointing, snapping pictures with their phones. Marlene, the red-haired painter, appeared beside Eleanor with a plate of pimento cheese and boiled peanuts. "Eat something," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten in hours." "I've eaten. Doesn't look like it. Are you okay?" "I'm nervous," Eleanor admitted, and the honesty of that confession surprised even her. Marlene looked at her with evaluating eyes, and then nodded, as if the honesty had earned her a point. "Good. Being nervous is better than being sure. Sure people make stupid mistakes. Nervous people pay attention. Is Constance all right?" "Constance is a volcano dressed as a glacier. She's been like this all week. Yesterday she asked me to go for drinks after work, and she had 3 bourbons, which for her is like anyone else downing a whole bottle. She didn't tell me why. She didn't need to." Eleanor lowered her gaze. "I don't want to hurt her," she murmured. "I know that already," Marlene said gently. "What I don't know yet is whether you know how not to." The question hung between them like smoke. Marlene gave her a firm pat on the shoulder, left her the plate, and walked off to speak with a collector who seemed interested in one of the larger pieces. The opening ended around 10. The last guest said goodbye with kisses on the cheek and promises to return. Ryan started collecting glasses and plates. Marlene left with a group of artists heading to continue the night at a bar on Congress Street. The gallery emptied until all that remained were the photographs, the lights, and 2 women. Constance locked the front door, switched off the lights in the main room, and left only the small gallery in the back lit, where Miss Della's portrait gazed toward her invisible point beyond the frame. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, and kicked off her shoes with a sigh of relief that was almost comical. "Sit down," she told Eleanor. Eleanor sat beside her on the cool, polished concrete floor, back against the same wall. They were closer than at the park. Half a yard, maybe less. Close enough for Eleanor to smell Constance's perfume, something citrus and earthy she didn't recognize, mixed with the residual scent of wine and the spent energy of a night of work. "My mother saw you," Constance said without preamble. Eleanor tensed. "What?" "My mother saw you. Last Tuesday. You were walking down East Jones Street, past the townhouse, around 11 in the morning. She was at the window watering her window boxes, the way she does every morning of her life and has for 30 years. She recognized you. And she came upstairs to ask me why Eleanor Caldwell was walking down our street after 12 years. The air in the gallery thickened. Eleanor felt the floor beneath her tilt slightly, like a boat in choppy water. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth," Constance replied, and each word came out with the weight of a stone dropping into water. "Not all of it, but more than I've ever told her." Eleanor stopped breathing. "I told her that you and I were not just friends," Constance continued, looking at Miss Della's portrait as if she needed the courage of that 93-year-old woman to keep talking. "I told her we loved each other. I told her your father found out and that's why you left. I told her you'd come back to return the truth to me." The silence that followed was so deep, Eleanor could hear the electrical hum of the gallery lights, that nearly imperceptible sound you only hear when everything else has gone quiet. "How did she react?" Eleanor asked in the voice of someone asking for the results of surgery. Constance closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were wet, but not from sadness. "She sat down in my armchair. She was quiet for about 3 minutes, which for my mother is an eternity, because that woman hasn't been quiet for 3 minutes straight since 1979. Then she looked at me and said, 'Is that why you cried so much?' That's what she said? That's what she said. 'Is that why you cried so much?' As if everything she needed to know fit inside that one question. And I told her yes. And her eyes filled up, and I thought she was going to say something awful, something that would break everything, something that..." Constance paused, swallowed hard, ran her hand across her eyes. But she didn't say anything awful. She said, "Baby, I heard you crying every night for a year. I heard it all through the wall, and I never understood how a friend could cause that much pain. Now I do." Eleanor pressed her hand to her chest, as if she needed to hold something that was about to overflow. "Then she asked if I still loved you," Constance went on. Just like that, direct, no beating around the bush. My mother is like that. She goes straight to the point the way she goes to church. No stops, no detours. And I told her I didn't know, that I wasn't sure, that it was complicated. And what did she say? She said, "The complicated things are the only ones worth having, Constance. The easy ones get forgotten." And then she stood up, kissed me on the forehead, and went downstairs to her apartment to make pot roast the way she does every Friday, as if she had just learned her daughter prefers dark chocolate over milk, chocolate, and not that her daughter had been in love with a woman for 3 years and had spent 12 years suffering over her. Eleanor let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, a strange noise that bounced off the gallery walls and blended with the hum of the lights. "Your mother is extraordinary," she said. "My mother is from rural Georgia," Constance replied. "Those women understand things the rest of the world is still trying to name. They don't need labels. They need their children to be okay. And if being okay means loving whoever you love, then that's what it is." "And she's really all right with it?" "I don't know. I'm not sure she understands all of it. She probably has questions she doesn't dare ask. She probably says an extra prayer every night. But she hasn't treated me any differently. Nothing has changed. And that, coming from a 72-year-old woman raised in a town where things were not named, is more than I expected." They sat in silence for a long while. The photographs of the Appalachian women watched from the walls, with those faces that had seen rains and droughts, and births and losses and dawns and everything that fits into a life, lived without shortcuts. "There's something else," Constance said. "Tell me." After talking to my mother, I went upstairs and opened a drawer I never open. The bottom drawer of my dresser, the one with a lock. That's where I keep the things I don't want to see but can't throw away. Photos of us. A movie ticket stub from a film I don't even remember. A cocktail napkin where you drew an awful cat one night at a bar on Congress Street. Things like that. Eleanor smiled in spite of everything. The cat wasn't awful, The cat was horrifying. It had 6 legs, and one eye bigger than the other. It was an artistic cat. It was a cat with issues, Constance said, and for 1 second, just 1 second, they both laughed. A short, fragile laugh, like a bird alighting on a branch, unsure whether the branch will hold. But it did, and the branch held. In that drawer, Constance continued, returning to her serious tone, I found something I'd forgotten existed. A photograph of us. Someone took it at a New Year's Eve party. I can't remember who. We're sitting on the rooftop of a house on Tybee Island, with the ocean behind us and the fireworks in the sky. You're looking at me. I'm looking at the fireworks. And whoever photographed us captured exactly that. You looking at me while I was looking the other way. Eleanor lowered her gaze. I was always looking at you, she said quietly. Even when I wasn't there, even in Charlotte, even with Patricia. I was always looking at you. Constance turned her head and looked at Eleanor directly. Their eyes were half a yard apart. At that minimal distance, every detail became enormous. The eyelashes, the fine lines at the corners, the damp shine of the pupils, the almost imperceptible line of an old scar on Constance's left eyebrow that Eleanor knew by heart. She'd gotten it at 15, walking into the edge of a table, and Eleanor had always found it the most endearing thing in the world. I don't know if I can forgive you, Constance said, and I don't know if that matters. Because what I feel has nothing to do with forgiveness. Forgiveness is for things you understand. I don't fully understand this yet. But what I do know is that when I saw you standing at my door a week ago, the first thing I felt was not anger. The anger came later, when my head had time to react. The first thing, what I felt before thinking, before deciding, before everything, was relief. A relief so enormous it frightened me, as if I'd been holding my breath for 12 years and could finally let it out. Constance. No, let me finish. Because if I don't say this now, I never will, and I'm tired of not saying things. I'm tired of protecting myself. I'm tired of being the woman who doesn't need anyone. I do need. I needed for 12 years and pretended I didn't. And that made me strong, yes, but it also made me alone. And there's a difference between being alone and being lonely, and I crossed that line a long time ago, without realizing it. The gallery lights hummed. Miss Della watched from her portrait with that sovereign gaze that seemed to say, about time. I'm not asking you to go back to what we were, Constance said. That doesn't exist. You can't return to 29 or to that apartment where everything was new and secret and thrilling. But I am telling you, I want to find out if there's something possible between what we were and what we are now. And I need you to be patient. Because I'm going to take 1 step, and then fall back 2, and then take 3, and fall back 1. And it's going to be frustrating and slow and messy. And I need you to stay even when it's like that. Eleanor extended her hand and placed it in the space between them, palm up. Open. She was not reaching for Constance's hand. She was only offering hers, the way you leave a door open without obliging anyone to walk through it. Constance looked at that hand for 5 seconds that lasted a lifetime. And then, with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows that what she is doing will change everything, she placed her hand on top of Eleanor's. The contact was electric and silent at the same time. Skin against skin, warmth against warmth. Fingers that recognized each other after 12 years as if hands had their own memory, their own language, their own truth that needed no words. Neither of them said anything. They sat there on the floor of an empty gallery, hands intertwined, with the photographs of 36 Appalachian women as silent witnesses, while outside, in the streets of Savannah, the October night moved forward with its procession of stars and stray cats and vendors closing their carts and couples walking beneath the street lamps without knowing that behind the locked door of the Forsyth Gallery, something that had been broken for 12 years was beginning, only beginning, to find the possibility of a new shape. The days that followed the Friday opening were different from all the ones before. Not because some dramatic change or grand declaration had occurred, but because the air between them had changed composition, the way autumn slowly replaces summer in the Low Country. You never know exactly when the shift happened. You just know the air isn't the same anymore. Eleanor was still at the inn. Constance was still in her apartment. But now they saw each other. Not every day, and never out of obligation. Constance sent brief messages that were, in their own way, coded invitations. The bakery on Broughton has peach cobbler today, but it sells out by 11. Or, the bookshop on Bull Street has a first edition of Flannery O'Connor you'd like. Or simply, coffee, 4 p.m., the usual place. The usual place was a small cafe on Liberty Street called the Sparrow. One of those Savannah coffee shops with dark wooden tables, walls covered in local art, an espresso machine that sounded like a locomotive, and a resident cat that slept on the newspaper every day. Constance had been going there for years, and the barista, a young woman with braids and floral tattoos, had her coffee ready before she reached the counter. A double Americano, no sugar, with a splash of oat milk. "Since when do you drink oat milk?" Eleanor asked the first day they sat together at the Sparrow. "Since I found out I'm lactose intolerant. About 6 years ago. My stomach decided we weren't friends anymore. Your stomach was always particular." "My stomach has standards," Constance replied. "It only likes what's worth having." They were conversations like that, light, almost trivial, serving to rebuild the fabric of familiarity without forcing anything. They talked about books, films, the exhibition, Constance's plans to take the photography show to Charleston, Eleanor's editorial life in Charlotte, the differences between Savannah coffee and Carolina coffee. They talked about everything except the essential, because the essential needed time to ripen, like fruit that isn't yet ready to be picked. But the essential was there, beneath every word, inside every silence, in every glance that lingered half a second longer than necessary. It was in the way Constance rotated her cup between her hands when Eleanor spoke, as though she needed to keep her fingers busy to stop them from reaching out. It was in the way Eleanor tilted her head slightly when Constance told a story, with a total attention more intimate than any caress. It was in the space between their bodies, which each day narrowed by a centimeter, like a tide rising so slowly you don't notice the water until it's at your feet. One afternoon, 5 days after the opening, Eleanor stepped out of the inn and found Miss Alice sitting on the stone bench in the townhouse courtyard, a wicker basket in her lap, and a string of rosary beads between her fingers. The old woman saw her come through the wrought iron gate and regarded her with eyes that were identical to Constance's. Dark, deep, impossible to read. "Come sit," Miss Alice said, and her voice carried the tone that mothers use when they are about to say something important and will not accept refusal. Eleanor sat. Her heart beat in her throat. "My daughter told me," Miss Alice said without preamble, without softening, without preparing the ground. "She told me what you were to each other and what happened." "Yes, ma'am. I know." "Don't call me ma'am. You've called me Miss Alice your whole life, and I see no reason to change now." "Miss Alice." The old woman nodded and sat looking at the dry fountain in the courtyard, the rosary resting between her fingers as if it were part of her hand. "I don't understand everything about the way the world works these days," she said slowly, choosing each word with the care of someone embroidering with a fine needle. "I don't understand the things they show on television, or the parades they have in June, or the rainbow flags. I wasn't raised to understand that, and at my age I'm not going to change who I am. But I understand one thing, and I've always understood it. My daughter cried. She cried every night. For months. I heard her through the wall, and I'd leave a plate of food by her door and go to my room to pray, because I didn't know what else to do. And now I know why she cried. And it wasn't because a friend moved to Charlotte. It was because the person she loved most in the world disappeared without saying goodbye. Eleanor lowered her head. There was no defense against that truth. I don't hate you, Eleanor, Miss Alice continued. I can't hate you because I watched you grow up. I watched you sit on this bench doing your homework when you were 15. I watched you eat my pecan pie every Christmas and say it was the best in the world, even when I'd used too much sugar. You are part of this house, whether you like it or not. But I'm going to ask you one thing, and I'm only going to ask it once. Anything, Miss Alice. Don't leave her like that again. If you're going to go, tell her. If you're going to stay, stay for real. But don't leave her in limbo again, because that's worse than a goodbye. My daughter is strong, but nobody is strong twice in the same way. The second time someone breaks you, the pieces are smaller and harder to put back together. Eleanor lifted her head and looked Miss Alice directly in the eyes. I'm not going to leave, she said. Not without her. Miss Alice studied her for a long moment, with that gaze that weighed and measured, and judged not by what she saw, but by what she felt. Then she nodded, rose from the bench with the surprising agility of a woman who has carried market baskets her entire life, and said, Go on upstairs. Constance left a note with Miss Dorothy. Eleanor climbed the stairs and found Miss Dorothy at her door, waiting with a folded note in her hand and a smile that was pure old woman mischief. She asked me to give you this, Miss Dorothy said, and she asked me not to read it. Obviously, I read it. Eleanor took the note. In Constance's slanted handwriting, in blue ink, it said, Rooftop, 8 p.m. Bring dinner. I'll bring the bourbon. The rooftop, Eleanor murmured. The rooftop, Miss Dorothy confirmed, one eyebrow raised, which is where you two always went when you thought nobody could see you. Oh, honey, if these walls could talk. Miss Dorothy, I don't say anything. I don't know anything. I'm 80 years old and deaf in my left ear. But I hear just fine in my right, so keep it down. I've got a doctor's appointment at 7 in the morning. Eleanor laughed. A real, full laugh that filled her chest and lifted a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. At 8 o'clock, carrying a bag of barbecue from the place on Habersham Street, the same pulled pork and slaw that had been their ritual Friday dinner 12 years ago, Eleanor climbed the narrow staircase to the townhouse rooftop. The rooftop on East Jones Street was a space that time had forgotten. The brick floor was uneven from the roots of a live oak, growing in the neighbor's yard that stretched its limbs over the wall like arms reaching to embrace something. There was a clothesline with white sheets billowing in the night breeze, a rusted water tank in one corner, and a wrought iron bench someone had hauled up there decades ago, and no one had bothered to bring back down because it weighed more than a judgment. And on that bench sat Constance, with a bottle of bourbon, 2 glasses, and the city of Savannah stretching out behind her like an ocean of twinkling lights that reached to the horizon where the tree line met a sky still holding one orange stripe from the sunset. You brought barbecue, Constance said, looking at the bag. From the place on Habersham. The one with the old man and the handlebar mustache? He doesn't have the mustache anymore. Full beard now. Time spares nobody. Eleanor sat on the bench. Constance poured bourbon into the 2 glasses without asking. She passed one over. Eleanor took it. Their fingers brushed in the exchange and neither pulled away immediately. It was an instant, maybe 2. But in those 2 instants, more information traveled between them than in all the conversations of the last 10 days. They ate barbecue and sipped bourbon watching the city, the smoky flavor of the bourbon mixed with the vinegar tang of the slaw, and the cool October air that carried the scent of dried magnolia leaves from the yards below. The evening felt exactly as autumn in Savannah always feels. Warm enough to sit outside, cool enough to need a jacket you forgot to bring, alive with the sound of crickets and distant jazz from the bars along River Street. "I talked to your mother," Eleanor said. "I know," she told me. "She called me an hour ago to say she'd made you cry and to ask if that was all right." "She didn't make me cry. I told her it was fine, that sometimes you need to cry." "I didn't cry." "Eleanor, your eyes are swollen." "It's allergies." Constance let out a short, dry but genuine laugh. "Allergies, sure." They ate in silence a while longer. The barbecue was gone. The bourbon was half empty. The city kept glowing below them, vast and indifferent, with its millions of stories unfolding simultaneously on every street, in every building, in every lit window. "Do you know what your mother said to me?" Eleanor asked. "Probably something that's going to embarrass me. She told me not to leave you in limbo, that if I stay, I should stay for real." Constance looked out at the city. The breeze moved her hair, and the amber glow of distant street lamps gave her profile a quality that looked like it belonged in one of her own photographs. "My mother is wiser than every book we've ever read," Constance said. "And she's right. Limbo is the worst. Worse than no. Worse than goodbye. Because in limbo you can't move forward or back. You just float. And I don't want to float anymore." "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, and her voice trembled because she knew the answer to that question was going to define everything that came after. Constance turned her head and looked at her. At that distance, a foot apart, maybe less, her eyes were two complete worlds, with their own geographies of pain and desire, and fear and something more, something Eleanor recognized because she felt it too. The desperate need to stop being afraid. "I want to try," Constance said. "But with new rules." "What rules?" "No secrets. Never again. If something happens, we say it. If something hurts, we name it. If someone threatens us, we face it together. No more unilateral decisions. No more protection nobody asked for. No more silence that turns into a void. I accept." "Don't accept so fast. Think about it. Because that means I'm also going to be honest with you about things you won't like. I'm going to tell you when I'm angry. I'm going to tell you when I need space. I'm going to tell you when I'm scared. And I'm going to need you not to run every time things get hard. I won't run. You ran once. And look what it cost. I won't run, Constance. Not because I'm brave, but because I already know what it feels like to reach the other side of the world and realize you left the only thing that mattered on a rooftop in Savannah." Constance blinked, and in that blink, Eleanor saw the last defense fall, the last wall, the last layer of protection Constance had built over 12 years of disciplined solitude. It didn't fall with a crash. It fell the way a leaf falls from a tree in autumn, silently, spinning gently, landing without sound. "Come here," Constance said. It was a single word, 4 letters. But it contained everything: the invitation, the permission, the surrender, the beginning. Eleanor moved closer. Constance took her hand and drew her in with a gesture that was not urgent, but deliberate, like someone choosing each movement knowing she will remember it forever. Eleanor rested her forehead against Constance's, and they stayed like that, forehead to forehead, breathing the same air, eyes closed, the entire city spread at their feet like a luminous witness. "I took too long," Eleanor whispered. "Yes," Constance replied. "But you came." Constance took Eleanor's face in her hands with a tenderness that contradicted all the hardness she had shown over the past 10 days. She traced her cheekbones with her thumbs, followed the line of her brows, touched her lips with a fingertip, like someone rediscovering a text she knows by heart, but hasn't read in years. And then she kissed her. It was a slow, careful kiss that was in no hurry, because it knew there were no more clocks or deadlines or fathers or sealed letters between them. A kiss that tasted of bourbon and slaw and the 12 years they had spent apart, and all the days they still had left to live. A kiss that was at once an apology and a promise, a closing and an opening, a period and a comma. When they separated, Constance had bright eyes and a smile Eleanor had never seen. Not the cautious smile of the past days, not the lopsided smile from the gallery, but a complete, generous smile that transformed her entire face and made her look for an instant like the 29-year-old Constance who wrote love letters at 3 a.m. and tucked them under pillows. "This is going to be complicated," Constance said. "I know. People will talk. Let them. My mother is going to want you over for pot roast every Sunday." Is that a threat or a promise? It's a fact, and her pot roast takes 2 days to make, so you'd better show up. Eleanor laughed, and then Constance laughed. And the sound of the two of them laughing together, on that old rooftop with its clothesline and its rusted water tank and its wrought iron bench that weighed more than a sentence, sounded like something Savannah needed to hear. Proof that some broken things are not discarded, but mended, and that some people who left were not running away. They were finding their way back. They stayed on the rooftop past midnight, talking about everything and nothing, sketching the first maps of a future that did not yet have a shape, but already had a direction. They talked about the practical things. Eleanor needed to sort out her situation in Charlotte, request a leave from the publishing house, or find a job in Savannah. Constance needed to prepare her world, the gallery, her friends, her neighborhood, for something that until now had been invisible. There were real obstacles: money, distance, the gaze of others, the weight of history. But for the first time in 12 years, the obstacles were shared. "It's not going to be easy," Constance said, her head resting on Eleanor's shoulder, looking at the stars barely visible through the amber haze of the city lights. "Nothing worth having is easy. Your mother said that." "My mother also says hot sauce doesn't burn if you eat it with faith, and that's a bald-faced lie." Eleanor squeezed Constance's hand. Constance squeezed back. Two pressures that said more than any speech, any letter, any word ever spoken or written. Below, in the courtyard of the townhouse, the fountain was still dry. But someone, probably Miss Dorothy, who knew things nobody told her and did things nobody asked, had placed a bundle of dried wildflowers on the fountain's edge, those autumn blooms that in the south mark the change of seasons, the quiet surrender of summer, the beginning of something cooler and more honest. But that night, the flowers weren't marking an ending. They were welcoming someone who had been absent for 12 years, and who, at last, had found her way home. The next morning, Eleanor woke at the inn with a message from Constance on her phone. It was not a coded invitation or a neutral piece of information. It was a direct sentence, without hiding places, without double meanings, without the armor of caution that Constance had worn like a second skin all week. It said, "Good morning. Last night was real, and today I want to see you." Eleanor read the message 3 times. Then she got up, got dressed, went down to the dining room where Miss Birdie already had the biscuits and the strong coffee ready, and said, "Miss Birdie, I think I'm going to be staying in Savannah longer than I thought." Miss Birdie looked at her over the top of her reading glasses with the expression of someone who has seen this particular movie before and already knows how it ends. "The room's available through December," she replied. "After that, I've got it reserved for a Danish photographer coming for the book festival. I'll have found something before December. That's what the last guest who fell in love in Savannah said. She's been living here 4 years now, teaches yoga in the garden on Saturdays. Eleanor smiled, finished her coffee, and stepped outside. Savannah greeted her with clean sun, fresh October air, and the sound of the bells of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist calling the 9 o'clock congregation. The vendors were setting up their stalls, children walked to school with backpacks bigger than their bodies, and somewhere a street musician, perhaps the same one from the first morning, perhaps a different one, perhaps all the street musicians in Savannah are the same soul multiplied on different corners, played a melody on a battered guitar that sounded like nostalgia and new beginnings at the same time. Eleanor walked down East Jones Street toward the gallery. She was not in a hurry. She was not afraid. She had something better. She had direction. And as she walked, she thought about the letter. That letter Constance had written at 3 a.m. on an October night, 12 years earlier, with blue ink and an open heart, and that had spent more than a decade sealed, kept, protected, waiting for the exact moment to be read. She thought about all the truths that can fit inside a closed envelope, and about how sometimes life needs 12 years to be ready for a truth that was always there, waiting, patient, still, like a seed in dry earth that needs only one drop of water to begin to grow. Constance was waiting at the gallery door, 2 cups of coffee in her hands and that new smile, the full, generous, unarmored smile that Eleanor was determined to earn every day for the rest of her life. "You're early," Constance said. "So are you." "I didn't come early. I was already here." "I know," Eleanor replied, taking the coffee Constance offered. "You always arrive first, so it doesn't feel like you're coming to my territory." "No," Constance said, and her voice was soft but steady, like a new certainty she was still learning to inhabit. "This time I came first because I wanted to be the first thing you saw when you arrived." Eleanor looked at her. Constance looked at her, and between those two gazes, in the tiny space that separated them, fit everything they had lost and everything they were about to build. A love that was neither new nor old, but different. A love with visible scars and new foundations. A love that promised not perfection but presence, not eternity but honesty, not the absence of pain, but the shared willingness to face it together. They walked into the gallery side by side, coffees in hand, the whole morning ahead of them. Outside, Savannah carried on. The cobblestone streets, the old brick facades, the centuries-old live oaks draped in Spanish moss, the cats dozing in the sun on iron balconies, the everyday life of a city that has survived wars, hurricanes, pandemics, entire centuries of change, and still stands, beautiful and stubborn, like everything that refuses to disappear. And somewhere in that townhouse on East Jones Street, Miss Alice lit a candle in front of her small altar, not for the dead, but for the living who had finally stopped hiding. And Miss Dorothy, from her window, saw 2 women walking together along the sidewalk and smiled with that smile only very old people have, who have seen enough of the world to know that love, when it is real, does not die. It hides. It transforms. It goes away. But always, always, it finds a way to come back. If you want the continuation of this story, write it in the comments. That's the only way I'll know you want more. And remember, YouTube prioritizes subscribers, so subscribe now so you don't miss the next story that will make you believe in love and in second chances. This is only the beginning. See you soon.